Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Friday, August 22nd, 2025. And on Fridays, we talk about human behavior and justifications. And so we're going to extend the discussion that we've had all week about deference and looking at it from different angles, different perspectives. And I've argued that it's, I think, reasonable and probably intelligent then to show deference to people who have a deep knowledge and wisdom about subject matters based on their studies, based on their expertise and their experience. And so, and given my background, I'm especially interested in scientific knowledge of all kinds and how we can best create and share that knowledge about how and why nature and people behave as they do. And so I've long been interested then too in why, at least sometimes, people reject or distort or ignore the best scientific knowledge that we have at our disposal. And so if we're going to be deferential then to scientific experts or experts in general, whatever their field might be, then that assumes two things, I think, at the very least. So first, that the conveyor of the knowledge, the sharing of that expertise and wisdom, that they are good faith actors. That is to say that they're sharing the information in good faith and with total honesty, and without attempting to deceive or defraud. And then second, and this might seem a bit odd, but the seeker of the knowledge also has to be, in my view, a good faith actor. That is, they have to be genuinely seeking truth and committed to acquiring the deep knowledge that's being shared without bias, without prejudice. In short, they have to truly want to learn. But that's not always the case, is it? And real deep learning requires an openness to receiving new information, to improving our understanding, and a kind of mutual trust between the conveyor and what's being conveyed and the receiver of that information. We have to be able to trust each other. So speaking for myself, I find that it's often difficult then to listen in some cases to so-called these public discussions and debates, especially if they're more about people just trying to win. They want to win the argument, win the day, look better compared to their opponent, and so on. And it's about using knowledge then as a tool to exercise power, authority, and ultimately dominance over others. And that's where I think the adage, knowledge is power, really comes from. And that is that people usually mean knowledge is power in this more political sense. It doesn't have to be. It can be used in non-political ways too. But if I have knowledge, in this sense that I'm talking about, then I can sort of lord it over others. Okay? I can wield my knowledge as power over other people. And you want to increase your, just examples. If you want to increase your wealth, your income, your resources, listen to me, and I'll tell you exactly how to do that. You want to get into heaven? Listen to me, because I have the key, the knowledge, and so on. So I can use that knowledge then for particular ends. But the biggest thing that I'm talking about is how people use knowledge, that is, facts, data, science, etc., to help make moral and political arguments. That is, they move from the is to the ought. I've talked about this before. From what we actually know about a subject matter to making judgments about what we should do. And people do that all the time. And that's where I think people most often misuse knowledge. That is, they use the knowledge, again, specifically to further their own goals, to increase their own power, their own status and reputation. And even worse, what happens is oftentimes people will either make up knowledge or information, or they'll just outright lie, or grossly distort the knowledge then to serve their specific purpose. Either way, the process undermines the genuine quest for understanding. And so once your discussion is more about trying to prove your point or prove the other person wrong or win the argument or get people to pass your policy bill or what have you, then you've mostly abandoned the search for truth and knowledge. Just watch the news discussions on TV or on the internet, or watch your typical podcast, even a great many YouTube channels for that matter. And they're presenting things, typically facts, information, etc., more because they want to persuade you to their side. Are they presenting the facts to truly teach and inform? Or are they using their platform and the information to wield power, just get bigger audiences for revenues or what have you? By the way, I've done many TV and radio interviews over the years myself because of my knowledge or expertise in certain areas, typically criminology related, typically related to areas of violence. And I realized long ago that I'm not the ideal guest because I'm way too scientific and I tend to stick too closely to the facts about the subject matter. I don't go off on tangents and then go off on my, about my own personal opinions and that sort of thing. And what they usually want, though, is for their guests to start making bolder claims and commentaries and statements that might stir up controversy. So, for example, over 20 years ago, there was a deep panic in the Washington, D.C. area due to the Beltway sniper. If you're watching from down in Virginia, some of you will know what I'm talking about. But it was an ongoing problem. Basically, what was happening is there was somebody, and it turned out to be a couple of people, but somebody's doing these random shootings. And this was in October of 2022. And they actually ended up killing 10 different people and injuring a few others over this kind of 3-week period. So in the midst of all of that, I was interviewed by a radio station up here in Canada and about what might be happening. And they were interested in serial killers. So I was presenting some research, some evidence with respect to serial killers, what we know about it. And I was sticking closely to the facts, what we knew about these individuals from a behavioral science perspective. But then I mentioned that I was speaking with my mother, which is true, because she lived in the area. And she was talking to me about her fears and the panic that was going on and what they were doing to cope, etc. And so that's all we ended up talking about then for the remainder of the interview. My knowledge as an expert quickly disappeared from the conversation. And we ended up just talking about, like I said, sort of the human side of the story, the human interest aspects. And so my point is we quickly abandoned the discussion about the scientific knowledge with respect to serial killers. And instead, what we were talking, and like, the main risk factors, et cetera, instead, what they wanted to know was what was the real life impact that this was having, right? How were people coping? And that's what people tend to gravitate towards in the news and in these discussions, because the next step after you talk about what's happening to people in a community or how they're coping with the flooding or a natural disaster, what have you, of some kind. The next question is, well, what do we do in response? How to help? What the government, what the police should be doing, and so on. So in other words, all the political and the moral stuff, and the chance for people then to vent their own frustrations, their own sorrows, for politicians to maybe, again, use their platform to tell people, whoever they are, what they should be doing, or how other people are incompetent and you should listen to them because they know what to do, etc. So knowledge, again, ends up being used essentially for power. And that's where, in my view, we should not just roll over and be deferential. So what should we be looking for then in terms of the knowledge and, with respect to whatever the subject matter in question? So in a nutshell, I think it's about trying to evaluate the information and the source of the information kind of along the dominance deference continuum, if you will. What do I mean by that? So in other words, if people are using knowledge beyond their expertise and shifting the discussion from the facts and the areas where they know a lot about to talking about what we should do about a situation, then there's a high probability that they're operating from a dominance perspective. In contrast, if someone's speaking directly about their own specialty, their own area of expertise, and they're trying to teach you what they know in good faith, then those are the people whom we should defer to, at least I believe in that context. So let me conclude then with a very specific example. So today I am, fingers crossed, hopefully submitting my latest book, my newest book, to my publisher for the final editorial review and publication, ideally sometime in the fall. So I've been studying and teaching and writing about terrorism for most of the last 15 years. And so the book kind of represents the culmination of that 15 years of work. Yay. So I know a lot about terrorism, the different kinds of terrorism, the global patterns that are involved, the different regions of the world where it's been more of an issue, the most prolific organizations involved, and of course, the main causes, the underlying reasons and motivations as to why people engage in different kinds of terrorism. Now, I'd hope that you can trust me on the subject matter, at least to share what I know about terrorism honestly, and by carefully explaining my definition, my approach, by outlining my methodology, my sources, etc. And then in that instance, if that's the case, then you should probably defer to me on the subject of terrorism, at least in terms of getting some really good, well-researched information on the topic. Again, doesn't mean I know everything, per se, but I probably know more than you do, simply because I've been studying the area. Just like if you've been playing violin for 15 years, you know a lot more about playing violin than I do, and you're going to be a lot better at it, more knowledgeable, etc. Okay, so however, having said that, where should you not defer to me with respect to terrorism? Well, on the political and the moral questions about what we should do about terrorism. In other words, or what are the best policies then to respond to terrorists, or how to punish terrorists, or whether we should launch drone strikes to take out certain leaders, all those kinds of questions. Yes, I have an opinion about that stuff to varying degrees, and hopefully it's an informed opinion, but I'm not an expert in any of that. Okay? And let me use a very direct example from history. So I've studied the Manhattan Project. Some of you will be familiar with that. I've studied it a fair bit, the history. I've read a lot over the years. And I know a lot about the history and the development of the atomic bomb. It's just something that I was always in, actually going back to my childhood. And I also know a lot about the U.S. government and their deliberations and how they arrived at the decisions then ultimately to drop the bomb in the places that ended up being targeted. And so basically what I'm saying is I know a lot about the history and the events leading up to August 6th and August 9th of 1945, almost exactly 80 years ago. And again, when we dropped the bombs, that is when the U.S. government made the decision under Harry Truman to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. But here's what I don't know. Okay? Should the U.S. have dropped the bombs on those two Japanese cities in 1945? Well, that's obviously a huge moral question. And of course, again, I have an opinion, but I'm not an expert on moral philosophy. And nor do I have the counterfactual information on what would have happened if the bombs had not been dropped. What would have been the consequences? How many more innocent lives would have been saved or lost under those circumstances? Again, I don't know. Neither do you. And there's the rub. So even if I'm the most knowledgeable person in the world on a subject, with more expertise than anyone else you've encountered, maybe I'm the top expert in the world. I'm just saying hypothetically. I'm not in any area. But you know what I can't do? Even if I'm the most knowledgeable person, I can't tell you what you or what we should do about that knowledge. Yes, again, I can share an informed opinion, but I have to always qualify that statement in my decisions, always. And your opinion, in that sense, might be just as informed and maybe just as valid as mine. Okay? And so finally, I mentioned earlier this week, remember too that part of the reason that we can show deference and respect to others is because there's often no one who has the absolute answer, or there is no single right answer to the question at hand. In other words, there can be many different answers. As I've said, the analogies, there can be many paths forward in life. There are many different paths to peace. There are many different pathways to health and happiness and so on. So I can't tell you which one to follow definitively. I can tell you about my path. You can tell me about your path. and maybe explore the reasons why. Okay. And I can even maybe comment to some degree on whether, the limitations of the pathways that I've chosen. Okay. But the point is that that's where I find it's good to have a fair amount of humility, both in terms of the limits of what we know as experts and in terms of recognizing that there's a lot more out there that we don't know and probably will never know. So I've read an estimated, I was thinking about this and trying to calculate, but I've read an estimated more than 20,000 books and scientific articles, journal articles, over the last 4 to 5 decades. And so here's a rough estimate. I'm going to do this visually between the total amount of my reading and my research and then my total understanding of what I think I know. So the total amount of reading and research has gone like this, and my confidence in what I know has gone like this. And over time, let me move over here, over time that gap has only widened. So I've read more and more and more, and I'm less and less confident about the totality of what I know. Okay, so it's an inverse relationship, and it only gets worse over time. At some point, I don't know when exactly, but I realized it was a futile proposition trying to learn everything. Okay, and yet I've been addicted nonetheless, and I remain as thirsty as ever. So I'll end then with one final non-scientific and perhaps controversial statement. 80 years later, and with the benefit of all that I've learned and all that I've read and all that we collectively know, I don't think we should have dropped the bombs. Now, I don't say that lightly or flippantly, and I don't say that with certainty either. But I'm not going to bore you with my reasons and my justifications. I'm sure you have your own reasons, justifications as well, and I have to respect that. And if you have better information and knowledge at your disposal on the subject matter than I have, then of course I might also end up deferring to you instead. But the point is all we can then do is keep the conversation going, keep asking the questions, and hopefully operating in good faith, doing our best to build knowledge and understand each other, the human condition, the world around us. And that's the goal of the Dr. J Vlog series too, by the way. So as ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.